That's Jaime Green that you see on the screen with me, the author of The Possibility of Life, the book that I hope a lot of you have read. As usual, we will be looking to you for your comments and questions for Jaime as we get into the hour. And also, as usual, I have pages of my own questions. We could easily, Jaime, as far as I'm concerned, we could go for 2-3 hours, but we won't. I won't do that to you.
No.
But I hope you're okay. Can we go a little bit beyond the hour?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Terrific. Okay. Well, just to give you a little bit of an introduction to Jaime, and this is right off her website, which you can find at jaimegreen.net, Jaime green.net, just like it sounds. Jaime Green is a science writer, essayist, editor, and teacher. She's also series editor for the Best American Science and Nature Writing, which I've gotten tons of recommendations for now because I downloaded the Kindle version of your book. Her writing has appeared in Slate, Popular Science, the New York Times Book Review, Astrobites, and many other places. She has, as you can see, joined us from her home in Connecticut, where she lives with her husband and son. One more thing to share, and this is the little quote from the review or blurb from the Washington Post. A wide-ranging and delightful survey, The Possibility of Life, is the kind of book that makes you exclaim, wow, out loud. I agree. Even more mind-blowing, though, is Green's ability to make us rethink everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. And I would only add to that the possibility of life elsewhere. So, yeah, Jaime, once again, thanks. We still have people coming into the conversation, I see. I first ran into you when we were both enrolled in that terrific workshop that was sponsored by NASA, Communicating Discoveries in the Search for Life, which had just an amazing who's who of people who work in that field. And not just scientists, but, folks like yourself and even me, who's sort of a dilettante, a hanger-on. But I thought it was so appropriate that you were there, and I was so intrigued by the book because of that that's why I picked it up and invited you to be here as one of our guests for the club.
So thank you to NASA for me ending up here.
Once again, as we should always thank NASA for so much. Let me start with this easy one. Who are Norman Epner and Miles Nova?
Miles Nova is my son, who is, I was going to say asleep upstairs, but definitely not yet asleep upstairs. And Norman Epner is my grandfather.
Oh, that's wonderful. Was he a special inspiration?
Yeah, so he died maybe 10 or 12 years ago, right before I started graduate school. And so right before I started writing about science. But he was an engineer and a gardener and was a very early influence in me getting interested in the natural world. I have a very vivid memory of sitting at the kitchen counter at his house, and we were eating roasted peanuts, and he took half a peanut, and it was the half with like the little germ in it, you know?
Yeah.
And he said, do you see that? Do you know what that is? I said, no. I was like 4. And he said, that's the part of the seed that becomes a plant, and he took me to watch a lunar eclipse when I was 5 or 6 years old.
Wow.
And it was actually so he passed away 10 or 12 years ago, and my grandmother, his wife, passed away last year. And it was actually at her funeral that a friend of theirs was describing the first time that this friend had gone to my grandparents' house, and they had a big backyard and a pool and his garden. And she described, like in the midst of her remarks at my grandmother's funeral, she described looking in the backyard, and she said seeing Norman and little Jaime walking around the pool in deep conversation. And I think that he saw like a tiny kindred spirit in me. And so it makes, I wish that he could have seen my science writing, but yeah.
And sounds like though he did a good job of helping to kindle that flame.
Absolutely.
In you. Speaking of flames, I saw that you wrote the romance book column for the New York Times, no less, for
Yeah.
2 years. So how did you end up moving on to the romance of The Search for Life Across the Cosmos?
So, I mean, I mentioned going to graduate school 10 or 12 years ago. Oh God, I guess at this point I started 14 years ago. I have to adjust my talking points. But I got my master's degree in creative nonfiction and came out of that very much an omnivore. I was writing essays and doing science writing. I was like writing for Astrobites and doing a little bit there, elsewhere. I was writing book reviews, all sorts of stuff. And at some point, I had written an article for BuzzFeed about romance novels in the wake of Trump's election and like how writers were responding to that and thinking about gender and power and things like that. And then it turned out that shortly after that, the Times was looking for a new romance reviewer. So I was just writing about all sorts of things. And it was really, it happened to be in those couple of years when I was writing that column that otherwise my writing life really coalesced around science. I was doing a little more science writing. The idea for this book was starting to come together. I became the series editor for Best American Science and Nature Writing. But it took a while, even though I had been writing about science that whole time, it took a while for it to really become the center of my writing work.
Well, romance writing's loss is science's gain, I think. Before I get into some of my questions, we've already got a really good one.
Oh,
from
man.
Tim Lynch. He says, which took you more research and effort, the science or the science fiction? And we're going to get into the science fiction angle on this in moments.
Yeah.
You covered a great deal of each in your book.
Yeah, I would say the science was harder. The science fiction probably took more time because I was reading full novels. Whereas a lot of the science, I wrote this book mostly in the first 2 years of the pandemic. So almost all of the science research was Zoom interviews and reading books by scientists and things like that. But if you've read the book, you see that it's much more conversations than me citing papers, because I was trying to get people to talk about things that are more speculative than what they're able to publish papers about for the most part. It was a lot of no, but if you just what do you think? You just go out on a limb. For the science fiction, I would guess about half of what's in there is books and movies and Star Trek episodes that I already knew and loved, and that were sort of the seeds of the idea for this book. I knew from the very first inkling of this idea that I was going to be writing about Sue Burke's book Semiosis, which is essentially about sentient plants and people. And I knew that I would be writing about The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. I knew I would be writing about Star Trek. That, it was because I knew and loved those stories that was where the idea for the book came from. But there was a lot of just okay, I need to find something where the story is sort of driven by being on a planet with different orbital mechanics, a different orbital setup than the Earth. Or, for months, people were you should read Embassy Town by China Miéville. You should read Embassy Town by China Miéville. And it took me so long to actually do it. And I was oh, this is the anchor of the section about language. Because, but it sometimes took me a while to find the right thing, because I wanted to be very careful to only write about sci-fi, with just a couple of exceptions, to only write about sci-fi that I really loved. So if I read a book about a planet that was tidally locked to its sun, to its star, where one face of the planet is always facing the star, but I didn't like the book, I didn't want to put it in there. So, it was just, I had to find the right books. And books take a while to read, but it also was it was really great where I'm sitting there reading just a great novel. I'm this is work. This is research. That was very fun.
That's how I felt reading your book and so many of the others that we feature on the book club.
Yeah.
It's great. They pay me for this. I like many of our members, because a lot of them make comments about this as we discuss the book online. I especially loved everywhere that you were able to use these anecdotes from Star Trek, particularly Star Trek, since I'm a major Trekkie, to introduce or to amplify these lessons about the search for life. We can maybe get into specifics in a moment, but I just wonder, how did Captain Picard's adventures inspire you?
So this is sort of twinned with my grandfather, is my father's influence. That when I was, and the grandfather is my mom's dad, so we're on both sides of the family. But when I was 7 or 8 years old, my dad put on Star Trek: The Next Generation. He had watched the original series growing up. He wanted to watch Next Generation. He put it on, and it became like a real thing for us, where we would watch it together. Or, so my parents are divorced, so when like the night it was on changed, I would watch at my mom's house and he would be watching at his house. And then every commercial break, the phone would ring and I would run into the kitchen and my dad and I would talk about what had just happened. What do you think is going to happen? And, oh, okay, it's back. Okay, bye. And then like I would run back into the living room. So, you know, Star Trek has been a part of my life for basically almost as long as I can remember. And that's why, you know, the first line of the first chapter is, of course, we start with Star Trek, because we do. Like, it's my book, and that's where we're going to start.
I don't know if I've told this story before, but you're roughly in the generation of my daughters. And we used to watch Next Generation together from our bed, from my wife's and my bed. And so at the beginning, when, you know, the Enterprise would zoom across the screen, they got into this habit of, they'd start on one side of the bed and they would jump across the bed just as the Enterprise was flying across space.
That is so sweet. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved it.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about a number of episodes. I mean, you know, the good old episode about the Horta from the original series, because I go back that far. But I was also thrilled to discover that you were as intrigued by a certain episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation as I was, the one called The Chase.
Yeah.
That came up with this convenient but fascinating explanation for why the Federation was always finding
the same.
Exactly. Right. And
it's so funny.
Talk about what you were able to do with that.
So that episode, it's so funny because it's like the sort of thing that should have dramatic repercussions across the Federation. And it is never mentioned again. But essentially, it is an episode that retcons and creates an in-universe logic for why there are so many humanoid aliens. Not all the aliens in Star Trek, but a bunch of them. And it's a what?
Sorry, I was going to say it's panspermia, but it's kind of
intentional. Exactly. Right. So it's called directed panspermia, which is this idea that not only did life start in one place and like maybe hitch a ride on a meteorite over to another planet, but that that billions and billions of years ago, some ancient progenitor race intentionally seeded the cosmos. In this case, seeded the galaxy. And it's a common enough sci-fi trope. It's also the underlying logic of probably my favorite sci-fi series, which is Ursula K. Le Guin's Hainish cycle, which I barely get to talk about in the book because they are all essentially humans. Because, you know, billions of years ago, the people of this planet called Hain set up all these like experiments on other worlds. And then those books mostly take place as the humans or humanoids of those other worlds are finding each other again and creating a sort of federation, a lot like the Federation in Star Trek. But so in The Chase, Picard's old archaeology professor, because we find out Picard was like this close to becoming a star archaeologist, he runs into his old archaeology professor who's on some sort of chase, some sort of quest, and the Romulans are trying to stop him and someone else might be trying to stop him. And it turns out that there are little bits of code, of computer code, sort of written into the DNA of like 17 or 19 different species. And when you put them all together and put it in a tricorder, it projects this ancient humanoid who gives you this lovely message And her there, it's a, you can tell it's a female actress, but it's like an ungendered alien. They say, we hope that if you've come together to play this message, it means that you're working in peace and collaboration, because that's the only way you could have solved this little genetic puzzle. And the Romulans and the Klingons are just like, ugh, disgusting.
Yeah,
and they walk away.
And the Klingon has that great line: if he wasn't already dead, I'd kill him.
I would kill. Right. This, like, you know, projection of this, like, very peaceful, like, and it's this really, you know, resonant message. This ancient alien, different kind of ancient alien, this like literally ancient alien, is saying, you know, we explored the whole galaxy and discovered that we were the only ones, and we felt so lonely, and we didn't want the galaxy to be empty, so we spread bits of ourselves throughout, so that all of your, basically, so that their descendants would not be lonely. And Star Trek is very much not a lonely cosmos. It's just, you know, and so that's where the book starts, right? Yes.
Pretty much. Yeah. And there are other great examples from Star Trek that come up during the book. I mentioned the Horta, speaking of life as we don't know it, which you do get into, of course. There are some wonderful paragraphs and lines and sections of the book, which I will, if I have time, I will read a few of them. One from very early on, I'll just read it. Thinking about who might be out there was thinking about the possibilities of existence and how humans fit into all of it, which sounds a lot like what our CEO, the science guy, Bill Nye, says all the time. Where do we come from, and are we alone? And that seems to be because this book, in fact, I have it farther into my notes, but you talked about Abel Mendez at the University of Puerto Rico, who keeps the catalog, right, of terrestrial planets as we keep discovering them. And he told you he doesn't even care if we find life elsewhere anymore. How is that possible?
It's so funny because when he told me that, I laughed and I was like, what? That doesn't make any sense. But what he was saying was essentially that in order to be an astrobiologist, he had to learn a lot about Earth, about life on Earth, about life's relationship with the planet, with ecosystems, biospheres, all of these things. And that the more he learns about life on Earth, the less he cares what else is out there, because life on Earth is so amazing. And I think most people tuning in have read the book. I don't know if, like, because basically writing the book gave me the same experience, where I came to this point at the end, ironically writing the first chapter about the origin of life, because I didn't write it in order. And that to me was just like the most fascinating science, because it was so new to me. I had written about exoplanets and astrobiology before and had, you know, a decent understanding of the concepts of evolutionary biology, but learning about the incredible intricacies in a cell and how, and just the common universal chemistry, but it's chemistry, it's so far beyond, you know, you pour two things and it bubbles up. Just like the incredible complexity of these evolved systems. It's amazing. And thinking and learning about different kinds of animal cognition, and thinking about how different animals experience the world differently because of their senses or the way they move or their size and their experience of time. I just found a lot of new wonder right here, like literally in my own backyard.
Again, it's further into my notes, but there's that species that was the marine species that was wiped out in the was the not the Cambrian explosion, but one of the great extinctions. I had to look it up. I'll have to find its name somewhere in here.
I'm not going to say it right because I learned how to say it for like the one day of recording my audiobook. But Analomacharis.
Yes, that's one. The one.
It looks like a little flying carpet.
Yes, you described it as a A cross between a trilobite and a flying carpet with these two tusk-like things out in the front.
That we don't know what they did, because we have the impressions of all these seemingly weird animals in the Burgess Shale, which is this record of just all of these body plans and evolutionary paths that were not followed. And we don't know that that's because they were outcompeted. It could just be a rock fell over here instead of over there. And so that one died and that one got to reproduce. Because if you look around, like the fundamental bilateral body plan is so common. We see it in bugs and birds and people. Like it's really just, invertebrate, not even all invertebrates, but like, starfish, right? Which still have bilateral symmetry, even if they don't have, it's not quite the same. But like things could have been so different, and evolution is so wildly imaginative and tried out all these different things. And we don't know why our version is the one that is here today.
You have this great term. It's not until the very end of the book that just made me crack up. It really delighted me. Eukaryocentrism.
Oh, yeah.
We're better than everyone else because our cells have nuclei.
Right. I mean, nuclei are pretty cool. They do some very good things.
No, I don't deny it. Let me read you another great paragraph from the book. It's about questions that transcend science. Questions like, excuse me, does the past reflect possible futures? How much does our experience constrain imagination? And what do we want humanity's future to be? In this way, science fiction is more than entertainment. It's a generative act that creates new possibilities of life beyond Earth, as valid and potent as anything we might conjure up in the lab. Through fiction, we can move beyond likelihoods and binary outcomes to look instead at what our imaginations do with the limitless possibilities of outer space, and crucially, ask what that might mean. That is a paragraph that should make any science fiction author proud. And so, we come back to that because of the importance of science fiction in not, sometimes it's following, but sometimes it's leading the way and pointing in directions that science may not have reached yet.
Yeah, I mean, like we see this very clearly in, I don't know, 100, 150 years ago, the idea that rockets were first thought of in science fiction and then figured out in physics. And if you go farther back, if you go sort of into the couple of centuries following Copernicus, the line between science and sci-fi doesn't exist. One of the greatest early works of science fiction is written by Johannes Kepler, who figured out orbital mechanics. Because he has this completely bonkers story, essay, treatise, like how do you even categorize it? Because it's imagined, it's a dream, but about about basically a guy who has a dream and finds out what life is like on the moon. And it was a way of testing out the implications of this new knowledge that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, that the other planets were worlds, thanks to Copernicus and Galileo. And so it's like, okay, if those are worlds just like Earth, there's probably life there. What does that mean? And it's like, testing out a new world view, taking it to its farther extreme and seeing what it's like. I
was fascinated to right in line with that, maybe a version of science fiction that goes back to ancient Greece, where you mentioned that one of the so-called atomists, the followers of, oh God, now I'm going to forget, who, Democritus.
Yes.
Who said that, well, if there's an infinity of worlds, there surely must be an infinity of species, based on no data, but what wonderful speculation.
Yeah, and even Aristotle, his, the Aristotelian cosmology of Earth at the center and all that you can see the sort of observational logic for it. Like, oh, it does look like the sun is going around us. Why wouldn't we be the center because we're here? But it also suited his worldview. That's why that view persisted so long, because the Catholic Church needed that worldview. Like it fit, their religious purposes. Similarly with the atomists, they didn't have experimental data that they were trying to fit to the theory. They just had concepts and philosophies and different ways of imagining the world to fit with that.
So here's a guy, Frank Drake, who came up with the Drake equation, which we talk about frequently. And when he created it, had essentially no data to work with.
Yeah.
But we've been filling it in very slowly ever since then. I'm thinking of Linda Billings, who I know reasonably well. I mostly have run into her at the biannual Planetary Defense Conference. But you spoke to her in this context of the Drake equation. And she's the one who said, like other people have pointed out, is it really an equation? It's more, maybe we should call it the Drake heuristic.
Yeah, and something really interesting I learned while researching the book is that Drake never meant for it to be an equation to be solved. It was an agenda setting exercise. It was essentially like the first American SETI meeting. There were like 15 people there or something. Like young Carl Sagan was one of them. And
Morrison, yeah, right.
Yeah, Morrison and Cocconi. And he was like, well, what do we need to know in order to know if someone's out there, to know if SETI is worth it? And what should we even talk about today? And so he was like, well, in order to know how many transmitting civilizations there might be out there, we would need to know this, that, and he just listed it out. So it wasn't, let's figure out the number. It was, what other things should we be studying? What else falls under our umbrella of concern if we want to know if SETI is a viable way of investigating the cosmos?
And it's held up so well. I mean, even if it's not really an equation, it is still treated as one of the most famous equations of all time. I mean, maybe not quite at the E equals MC squared level, but pretty close, I would say.
Yeah, it's pretty close.
So continuing with that, but really going back to the origin of life. And as I look away, I'm keeping track of questions that are coming up from folks.
Okay.
Remember, you can post any of your questions in chat, where our colleague and good friend Amber Trujillo is keeping track of those and feeding some of them to me. And also adding, if you're not looking at the chat right now, lots of excellent links, like I see went to Linda Billings' bio on the planetary.org website. Nice work, Amber. So I'll just phrase it this way about the origin of life. Which came first, the metabolism or the RNA? I'm tempted to say the RNA, the RNA egg. Thank you.
I might have to steal that.
So much. There'll be another show at 10 o'clock tonight. Synthetic biologist Kate Adamala, you talked with her, and she says it's not one or the other. They're both right. They're both wrong. And, give us a little background for anybody who maybe missed that piece of the book.
Yeah. So the study of the origin of life is a fascinating field to me, partly because it's this pursuit of this impossible question, which is, we are never going to know how life began on Earth. And researchers will tell you, they're not trying to say, oh, here's how it happened in this pool on that ancient continent. Like, they're trying to understand how life does emerge, how life could have emerged. But there is still that impossible answer at the heart of it. And it's also historically, it's a young field, but historically a pretty contentious field. So I think the sociology of this discipline is really interesting too. But the two, and so there's this sort of dominant camp, this dominant theory that the beginning of life was essentially the abiotic origin of RNA. Because RNA can transmit information, it can also serve as an enzyme and catalyze chemical reactions. It's like a multi-tool. And
Yeah.
so it could
Yeah.
have,
Swiss
so
Army knife of
yeah, so
living molecules. Yeah.
if we're thinking about complex molecules that are needed in order for life to exist, this is one that sort of takes care of a lot of it. And so that's like the dominant theory, to the point that people who are pursuing that line of inquiry think that it's sort of settled. Then you get people who are in the metabolism first camp, who think that first life figured out, or chemistry figured out, how to sustain chemical reactions from an energy source, how to use energy to make more of itself. And that's another really interesting camp. And for the readers out there, there's a really great book by one of the sort of leading voices in that corner, named Nick Lane. The book is called The Vital Question. I cite it a lot in my book. It's one of the books that, I mean, his description of how the ATP molecule works, like sort of how the Krebs cycle works, if anyone wants to cast your mind back to high school biology. He has a new book out about ATP called Transformer, which I haven't read yet. But The Vital Question is essentially him putting forward this argument for energy being sort of at the core of life's emergence and at the core of so much in life, why we have programmed cell death, why we tend to have two sexes, and other things. It's just like a really, really great book. But so then there's the idea that, you know, it's energy. Other people focus on compartmentalization, because a defining factor of life is that it has a boundary. Cells have membranes. We have skin. There is something dividing the inside from the outside, and the inside is where all the cool stuff happens. Also, the inside and the outside is how life gets around the problem of entropy, right? Because life is seeming to subvert the fundamental law of thermodynamics, that the universe moves towards entropy, towards disorder. Life is an order engine. It creates more order. It creates complex systems. We're able to do that because we have an inside and an outside, the same way that your refrigerator creates coldness or gets rid of heat. It's because it's putting all that heat somewhere. Similarly, we're creating entropy elsewhere. We have all this order inside our body. So there are researchers who study ways that in the early Earth, interesting chemical stuff could have been happening. Like, what gives you compartmentalization for free? Is it the pores in undersea rocks? Is it bubbles in mud that sustain themselves? There are just so many fascinating questions. But I think because it's a sort of very interdisciplinary and sometimes fringy field, which is something that astrobiology shares, there's like a contentiousness where there's this need to be right, which I think maybe comes about because no one's going to ever know who was right. There's no winning. And so people are like pushing really hard. But the younger generation of researchers are moving in a much more sort of collaborative direction. Kate, who you quoted, is part of that generation, where I think they're realizing that all of these different angles are necessary. Like, I think astrobiology realizes that we need biologists and geochemists and astronomers and you know, everything, atmospheric scientists, planetary scientists, to be able to understand the big picture. And I think that Origin of Life Studies is going that way, but has not always been there.
There is so much more in this book for us to get to, and so many other questions I have. But let me go to a couple that we're getting from other folks. Let's see. Kevin Rush. I love this. What is your next book? I should have saved this for the end. Could you do it on science fiction? You are so knowledgeable.
Oh my gosh. I appreciate that so much, because I did have a lot of worry writing this book. I was like, oh, I wish I could just get a PhD in science fiction studies and then write this book, because I just know what I've read, and I love science fiction, but I read other stuff too. I was the romance reviewer for 2 years, where all I read was romance novels, and there are not nearly enough sci-fi romance novels. There are some, but I really wish there were more. And so I'm really glad that I came across as knowledgeable, because I was worried about that. But no, I don't think I'm going to keep writing about science fiction. Science fiction was a really useful lens for writing about the possibility of life elsewhere. And it was a way, you know, when I first had the idea to write about this, I did the thing that a lot of aspiring writers do, where I'd go to the bookstore and I'd visit the shelf where my future book was going to be. And then there were like 4 books on that shelf already on the topic, and they were all written by astronomers. And I was like, that's not a good sign. And so it took me a while to figure out my version of this book, and bringing sci-fi into it was what really unlocked it for me. But that feels specific to this book. I don't have a second book, like, under contract, in progress. I'm still working on it, but yeah, I definitely want to keep writing books. That's where I'll leave that one.
I'm glad to hear that. Here's another nuts and bolts type question
Okay.
from Todd Thallimer. I know Matt usually asks this, but I'm wondering is there anything Jamie had to leave out of the book, either due to editorial or other reasons?
Not really. I'm trying to think. I, for a while, thought that in the chapter about people, I might write about Neanderthals through the lens of Jean Auel's book, The Clan of the Cave Bear, which is a book that I have loved since I was 12 years old. And I was able to write an essay about that when my book came out. I wrote an essay for Slate that I think is called My Favorite Aliens Once Lived on Earth. Because I think that reading that book when I was 12 about 2 different kinds of people, 2 different kinds of humans connecting across the gap of their differences, that I realized as I was writing this book that was also a part of the inspiration for this, that it was Star Trek, it was other things, but it was also Clan of the Cave Bear. But that didn't fit. So it became its own essay. But one of the things I loved about writing this book and writing it as like a creative nonfiction writer rather than a scientific expert is that it really could be shaped by my interests and my loves. That's why there are no books in here that I don't love, except for Solaris, which I like parts of, but respect so much that it's in there.
That's how I felt about the movie too, by the way.
Yeah. It's just like, it's so like mid-century, like all the women are literally projections of the men's psyches.
That's true. Yeah, right.
It's like part of the plot, but it's also like, oh, so she's like still 19, got it, and she's coming, but the alien stuff is just so cool. So that was how that one stuck in there. But yeah, the Neanderthals, I think I may mention them briefly, but I didn't get to dig into that. Otherwise, no, I think there was like, there may be like little sentences, like weird little flourishes. There was a reference to the video game Katamari Damacy that was going to be in there when I was describing how planets form. If anyone knows Katamari, you get the sort of like accumulation thing. But, these little references that were like little jokes that made me happy, but really were not necessary, that sort of, made me excited as I was writing. But some of those little jokes with myself stay in, like that first line, of course we start with Star Trek, was just my way of getting myself writing, where I was sitting down to write the opening, no pressure, right? You're writing the first line of your book. So I'm like, well, of course we start with Star Trek. And that was just how I got into the writing. And then after I wrote that section, I did my writing for that day, I was like, I kind of like that first line. It's very strange and silly, but it pleases me. And
it's a great prompt.
It made it all the way through.
I got one here. Unfortunately, I didn't write down the person's first name, but it's another concept in the book that floored me. Butler seems to be proposing then that the very
Octavia
structure...
Butler.
Octavia, of course,
yeah.
I should have known. Seems to be proposing then that the very structure of evolution on a planet becomes ingrained in the ethos of life. Behavior not coded for, but arising out of the way that code is transmitted through generations.
Yeah.
Which just seems profound.
I was really happy with that moment, because that was, so like I said, I don't have a PhD in science fiction studies at all. But that was a moment where I felt like, because I had been doing this research into evolutionary biology and learning a lot about that. And by research, I mean having scientists tell me about their research. I'm like, not in the lab. And then I read this book, Dawn by Octavia Butler, which I think is just an amazing sci-fi novel. Everyone talks about Parable of the Sower. Dawn is where it's at. And the aliens in that book have the ability to edit DNA. It's sort of part of how they mate. And it's also part of their technology, that instead of having metal and plastic technology, they have biological technology. And they identify as traders. They trade, where they meet other species and they trade bits of genetic code that are necessary. So, for example, in the book, they discover that humans get cancer and they don't get cancer. And they actually find something useful in that for, I think, like speeding up their cellular replication or whatever. And they mention that one of the problems with humans is that they are, I don't remember the word they use, either competitive or hierarchical. That's what it is. And I was like, okay, so a fatal flaw of humanity in their view is that we are hierarchical. And they, on the other hand, are acquisitive. They're always getting good bits of genes and whatever. And I was like, that sounds a lot like horizontal gene transfer. One of the ways that bacteria, because their genes are not sequestered in a nucleus, tend to get new genes, new abilities, characteristics. Exactly. This is how antibiotic resistance often spreads, is they're able to just pick up genes from like their neighbors, not their relatives, not their lineage, not their same species. They can sort of get it from anyone and then just like plug that code in, and now they can be resistant to antibiotics. And I was like, that sounds a lot like these aliens. And it is also manifested in their culture, in their values. And you can see how Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest, competition is sort of manifested in human values and Western values. You know, to what extent is that because Darwin and Darwin's thinking is a product of that culture? Who can say? But I was like, oh, this is a way to interpret this novel in the context of evolutionary biology. Yeah, so that's a Jaime Octavia Butler collab.
But this still was a civilization and intelligent species that we can understand. I mean, after all, it came out of the mind of a human writer, Octavia Butler. But as you get into the parts of the book about really understanding how other living things perceive their environment and how they communicate, it made me wonder, you know, can we ever hope to truly imagine what it means to be alien, or what alien intelligent might be? I mean, we might get lucky. They might, you know, play baseball and do other stuff we understand, but there's a good chance they won't.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big open questions. And I think that we shouldn't assume that they are going to think like us. In Embassy Town by China Miéville, which I mentioned earlier, he has a sort of almost throwaway line. So this is set in a cosmos where humans have met many, 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 many kinds of intelligent aliens. And he mentions that there are aliens with whom we share a conceptual map and aliens with whom we don't. And those whom we share with whom we share a conceptual map, we can talk to them, we can learn their language, we can sort of exist in the same society. But if you don't share that worldview, that conceptual map, you can't. And you see this in Star Trek too. You know, there are aliens who we can talk to, who we can have children with, whose food we can eat, whose languages we can learn. And then there are incomprehensible entities where we barely know what they want or what they're trying to do. And if there is a lot of life out there, it's very possible that it is like Star Trek or like Embassy Town, where some were very different from, but I really don't know.
And neither does anybody else.
Right.
Which is part of what makes this so exciting and part of what makes the book so exciting, I think.
Yeah.
I wonder, as you talk about a conceptual map, maybe a perceptual map as well, if anybody else out there kind of questioned the ethics of that linguist, Guy Deutscher, I think, who didn't teach his daughter what the color blue is. I mean, she could see it, but he never used the term.
It's just for the sky. It's just the sky. And this is, I heard this on an episode of Radiolab. I think one of the best Radiolab episodes ever about color.
Great show.
And I don't know that there is robust sourcing for this other than on Radiolab. But according to this episode of Radiolab, because there is a big difference among human cultures in how we describe color. And I don't remember his inspiration, but it's basically not every human culture, I think, says that the sky is blue. And so he wanted to see what would happen if he never told his daughter that the sky is blue. You know, let her grow up, learn her colors. So she knew what blue was, but never mentioned the sky. And then when she was about 4, and again, this might be apocryphal, but although my fact checker let it slide, so who knows. When she was about 4, he asked her, what color is the sky? Like on a clear day. And she was kind of puzzled. And then she was like, well, it doesn't have a color. But then once it was suggested to her that it was blue, she was able to see it as blue. And sometimes I will look at a blue sky and try to imagine that. Try to sort of see it without knowing that I can't. It's very interesting. And it's very interesting that once the idea was introduced to her, she was like, oh yeah, it is blue. And so she was okay.
Absolutely fascinating insight, though, into, I mean, just scratching the surface of what it might take to understand an alien intelligence.
Yeah.
Jamie, we got some celebrity comment from one of our viewers out there. You know Jim Green, a good friend of ours, retired chief scientist of NASA. Jim says, please read The Next 500 Years by Chris Mason. Our first humans on Mars will be genetically engineered, something that I think our next book club guest, Robert Zubrin, also agrees with. I'll come back to that at the end. He goes on. He goes on to say, Jamie and I are not related, but another wonderful Green to hear from.
Hello. Yeah, I will say, and I wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine recently about sort of the problem of space junk in low Earth orbit. As far as, you know, Mars futures go, I probably tend to fall more in line with A City on Mars, which I think that was that a past book of yours? The Wienersmith's book?
They were past guests, yes.
Yeah. So
Zach was here.
I like their thinking a lot. And I think part of what researching and writing this book, it not only made me appreciate life on Earth, but made me appreciate Earth so much and really question so many of our assumptions about the future of humanity in space and like what our trajectory is.
And we will get into that next month as well with the always interesting and frequently provocative Robert Zubrin. I might as well mention it now. There is his new book. It is called The New World on Mars, and he is not a fan of the Wienersmiths or A City on Mars. But
and now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure that I quoted him in my New York Times piece.
It is fascinating, and it is full of detailed explanations of how Bob feels we will manage to survive and thrive on Mars. I think that a lot of that remains to be seen, but that's what we'll talk to him about. Back to E.T. Hey, let me ask you, first of all, who's your favorite alien? He's not my favorite, but I couldn't resist.
Oh my gosh. I loved him, especially
E.T.'s evil twin, Marvin.
Yeah, in the age of the WB store in every mall where everyone was wearing like shirts with like Tweety Bird and Marvin the Martian and everything, when I was like, I don't know, in middle school, Marvin the Martian was my fave.
Oh, yeah.
This is sort of what I write about in that essay for Slate about Neanderthals, where I think they're my favorite alien. I don't have a favorite sci-fi alien. I get asked this question all the time. I never have a good answer. And then I realize it's because, I don't know if this title made it to print, but I think of that essay as being called My Favorite Aliens Once Lived on Earth. And because it's also the fictional version of Neanderthals in Jean Auel's books, are just fascinating to me. And there's so many fictional aliens that are even more like humans than those Neanderthals are. So I don't think it's too much of a cheat for them to have, actual evidence in the fossil record.
I love it. And a little bit of a few of their genes. In
about 2%. Well.
Yeah. I do have a favorite, by the way. It's not Marvin.
Yeah.
It's another Martian. It's Uncle Martin, played by the wonderful Ray Walston, who would pop up again in Star Trek several times. But I'm sure it's way before your time. It was a fun show. My favorite Martian was a terrific show. Another contact that you and I have in common, a friend, I hope, Seth Shostak.
Yes.
Who has been saying for years and said to you that we probably shouldn't be looking for something that shares our chemistry out there among the stars, at least among intelligent species. But looking for AIs. But, if they have gone beyond the point of human understanding, beyond the singularity, how would we even recognize them unless we just find their excess heat or something like that? Which then is another thing you talked about, the transition that a lot of SETI scientists have made from, listening for the message to trying to catch their evidence of entropy.
Yeah, moving from searching for signals to searching for technosignatures. Part of that is that in the 90s, Congress said that NASA couldn't fund SETI research anymore, but then astrobiology and biosignatures became a thing. And so the SETI researchers were like, well, we're just looking for technosignatures. It's just like biosignatures, but it's technosignatures. Because a SETI signal, like someone sending us a hello, like in contact, that is a technosignature. But it's not just a way of getting around funding restrictions. It's a way of looking for evidence of technological life that doesn't require anyone to be trying to get in touch with us. And that looks at, I use the word agnostic a lot, agnostic technosignatures that aren't making any expectations about anything that the alien civilization or aliens would be doing, except that if they're making technology, then that requires using energy, and there's going to be waste energy because of the second law of thermodynamics, I think, the entropy one. And so we would be able to detect that heat. But this also has its origins in science fiction, because what they're essentially looking for are Dyson spheres, which was an idea coined by Freeman Dyson that he got the idea for from a I don't remember the year, 30s, 39 maybe, sci-fi novel Star Maker. So it all still comes back to sci-fi.
Isn't that wonderful? And of course, Dyson spheres that showed up in a Star Trek The Next Generation, or a sphere that showed up in that episode. I asked Freeman Dyson once, did they tell you that they were going to have a Dyson sphere? He said, no, he heard it from one of his kids after the show was on Star Trek.
And they even have a little moment where Data is like, yes, they were coined by Freeman Dyson, a 20th century physicist. And It's like, the same way that on Star Trek, everyone knows everything about jazz. It's like, why?
Right,
You've had many centuries since then, but.
Although Commander Riker needs to stick to his day job, as we heard once. Let me get to another question here.
Yeah.
We are rapidly closing in on the end of the hour, so I'm glad you're able to stick around a little bit.
Yes, for sure.
This is from Susan Stalker. Thank you for writing this book. I love how it answers questions I didn't know I had. That's a great line, Susan. But also inspires new questions like the following. Since so many species have convergently evolved wings, you talk about that. I mean, the great
Yeah.
example of birds and bats, right? Do you think humans will ever attain that capability? I'm not sure where who would we converge with, Susan? Do you know,
Well,
Jamie?
I think she's asking if we're going to evolve wings. But one of the tricky things about civilization is that we are sort of subverting evolutionary pressure on humanity.
Yeah.
It used to be that think about, I'm sure most people here can think about a reason that you would have died before reproductive age. Like I've been wearing glasses for most of my life. I'd be a very bad hunter-gatherer. I would not be able to see the saber-toothed tiger coming at me. I also would have died in childbirth, and my kid probably would have died too if it weren't for modern medicine, right? So which I don't think was because of any particular evolutionary shortcoming in our case. It was just like a normal, I won't get into my birth story here, so I'll save that for another time. But
Okay.
in terms of various diseases, inherited things, weaknesses, eyesight, whatever it is, evolution isn't culling humanity, especially not in developed countries, the way that it used to. So the evolutionary pressure isn't there. The way that I've heard it put in terms of like individuals aren't sort of where evolution is exerting its pressure anymore. Now it's more societal. What are the elements of society or technology that are surviving and continuing and sort of from which the future will branch? So I remember when I was little, I used to think that humans were I like know what ape feet look like. They look like hands, and I know what my feet look like with my little toes. And I sort of imagined or thought that meant that humans would eventually not have toes anymore. Turns out you need toes. They're very important for walking and balancing. And then we have things like appendices that we don't need anymore, but haven't gotten rid of because there's no evolutionary pressure to get rid of them, partly because we have modern medicine for appendicitis. If we didn't have modern medicine to save people who had appendicitis, then if some people by a fluke evolved to not have an appendix anymore, and they didn't have that vulnerability, they would probably have higher survival rates of childhood. And then maybe in 100,000 years, we wouldn't have appendices anymore. But for the most part, we don't have that selective pressure on us anymore, thankfully. The other thing is that evolution, over the course of the history of life on Earth, life has specialized and branched. And so, I was reading something recently about an ancient mammal predecessor, sort of before the time of dinosaurs. And so I was thinking like, okay, well, and they were describing the animal as a quadruped, whatever, about how big it was. I was like, okay, but is it a mammal or is it a reptile? And the thing is, it was neither, because neither of those groups had diverged. And so it was, this like mushy neither thing. And so we're basically at a point where like we are not going to develop wings because we've gotten past that point. That there's been so much differentiation. Just the billions of years that life has existed on Earth have sort of culled the possibilities. Same as like you're not going to evolve a whole new family of life on Earth with a bilaterally symmetrical body plan, because like that choice has been made for life on Earth already.
But I go back to Jim Green's example, or his prediction that we will, and we already have started, to reshape our own genomes intentionally, directed evolution, if you will.
Right. And that's already happening not in terms of gene editing, but testing. The fact that if you know that you're a carrier for a genetic condition, we can test for that. You can find out if your partner is also a carrier. And if they are, or if it's a dominant condition, you have IVF and you screen the embryos. Like we have these technological abilities so that like there was an amazing article in The Atlantic last year or the year before about Down syndrome. Well, we are now at the point where there's the possibility that people with Down syndrome will not exist in 100 years.
Wow.
And that's a very fraught thing, like, is that right? This is also a big issue in the deaf community, that many deaf people see deaf as part of their identity, see deafness as part of their identity, and don't want that to be corrected.
Don't want cochlear implants.
Right. And don't want
Yeah.
sign language, which is like the foundation of their culture, to be made obsolete. So, those are just a couple of examples that I can think of now. Who knows what it'll be in 50 or 100 years? And so where is the line between diversity and difference and, defect? And I'm not saying that I think that deafness or Down syndrome are defects. I just want to be really clear about that. My eyesight is a defect.
Yeah, mine too. And my hearing, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Who would refuse greater resistance to radiation if you were a Martian?
Right.
The one that I want, of course, is that when I live on the moon someday, I want to have wings, so when they start sealing up those lava tubes and filling them with air, I can fly around. Which was
it'd be amazing.
My favorite Robert Altman movie, Brewster McCloud, sort of.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, great movie. I want to go back to our beloved Carl Sagan.
Yes.
In the chapter that shares the title of that movie and book that he created with Ann Druyan, who's also been our guest. You obviously think pretty highly of it. We do too. In fact, we had a special screening of it at our eclipse celebration in Texas.
Oh, cool.
We could spend our entire time together talking just about that movie and the book, and why did they change the ending, which in fact you mentioned in the book. But it does seem like maybe, especially if it's added to, oh Lord, now I'm going to forget, the more recent film about the aliens who come to
Arrival.
Earth. And Arrival, of course. Thank you. Another great film.
Yeah.
But just the meaning of these two works of science fiction, which seem to have done such a good job of capturing not just how alien life or the discovery of other intelligence might affect us, but also, that's really it. What it might mean to our own civilization if that happened. I mean, you talk about John Traphagen, who says maybe it won't be the world-changing discovery that Carl Sagan and others believed it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's from his research, or I think maybe Stephen Dick's research. One of them writes about the fact that there have been 6 or 7 times in modern human history that we've thought we found life on another world. And for centuries, after the Renaissance, up until I would say the 70s and the Viking landers on Mars, we thought there was life on other worlds. Many scientists, until we got the first images of Mars in the 70s, thought there would be grass there. And so it's only in the last handful of decades that we've started to really think that we're alone and that we don't have evidence for otherwise. And I think something that's so interesting about Arrival and Contact, and especially the short story that Arrival is based on, which is The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. In the story, we do not find out why the aliens have come. They come, they're weird, and then they just leave. Whereas in the movie, there's like a whole reason. There's big reasons why they're there, which I think is another sort of Hollywoodization of a story, where that sort of ambiguity and lack of resolution just is not going to work in a movie. Whereas in Contact, in the book, it is extremely clear why they have come, what they're going to do. It is still, there is an unresolved feeling at the end, because Ellie wants answers. She wants everything. She wants full access, and, small moves, just one little thing at a time. Wait until your civilization is ready for it.
Right.
But, it's very much a wish fulfillment story. And I say this with the utmost respect for Carl Sagan and Andrean and for their writing and for his work, but he was imagining how he hoped, I think, things might go.
And I think that Anne would agree with you.
Yeah.
Much as the golden record was created for us, more than that extremely unlikely possibility that somebody else is going to find it. So fascinating stuff. And you also point out that in Contact, we never see the aliens. Same with 2001, unless you count the Star Child at the end, who's just sort of a metaphor for what Bowman has become.
And interestingly, in Arrival, or Story of Your Life, so I interviewed Ted Chiang and I asked him if he knows what the aliens' motivations are, if he knows what's going on inside their minds. And he said, not at all. They're completely opaque. So whereas in Contact, we don't see the aliens, in Story of Your Life, we don't have access to their interior. And I think it's a similar move of needing to maintain that mystery and otherness, because if we knew, it would necessarily be a disappointment.
Yeah. And I know that Arthur C. Clarke and Kubrick discussed whether they should show the aliens in 2001. And they thought, no, they finally decided better just to leave them
absolutely
as the force that can't be seen. I got one more for you from someone out there, Jeff Oyang. And I'm not sure what to make of this. He says, do you think SETI-inspired fields could lead to, or at least accelerate, new discoveries and better understanding of how life arose and evolved on Earth? Interesting jump there from the search for intelligence.
I think it's less SETI and more that is a stated concern of astrobiology. So astrobiology, at least as far as NASA is concerned, has 3 pillars, which are the evolution, or like the origin, distribution, and then something else of life in the cosmos.
Maybe Jim Green will help us out here.
I know, Jim, tell me what astrobiology is. But the origin of life is part of astrobiology, which is, the broader field of understanding life's existence in the cosmos. And the reason that I talk about the origin of life in my book is because in order to imagine how life might be on other worlds, we need to think about how life begins. Is it easy? Is it hard? What is required? How does it happen? What kinds of places could it happen in? But as for SETI specifically, I don't think so unless we get into the territory of like Carl Sagan's imagined Encyclopedia Galactica. He talks about this in Cosmos and on the Cosmos TV show, that he's sort of speculating like, oh, if we got a signal, maybe it would be an Encyclopedia Galactica, which he talks about being a sort of directory of all the inhabited worlds in the galaxy, or maybe also access to the knowledge and scientific discoveries and insights, as well as sociological and cultural insights of a more advanced alien world. Would they tell us how to have world peace? Would they tell us how to avoid nuclear war? Would they tell us how to avoid climate change? Would they tell us all these scientific things that we don't know? But that, I think, is pretty commonly accepted now as a lovely fantasy, but a very unlikely way for things to go.
I hope that feeling is proven wrong. That someday they drop it on us. Great. Wouldn't it?
It would be great.
I am compelled to point out that the Encyclopedia Galactica is vastly outsold by the Hitchhiker's Guide. Bring your towel. We should start wrapping up. And I'm going to do that, first of all, by saying I haven't seen it, but I love your tattoo.
Thank you. It's on my leg.
You don't need to hold your leg up to us, but
I've got a Hubble up here, though.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. Okay. I have been threatening to my family for years. Everyone in my family, including my 93-year-old mother, has a tattoo, except my wife and me. And I keep saying, I'm going to get a pale blue dot. I'm just going to get a pale blue dot. But I don't know. I think maybe a pale blue dot in the middle of that cosmic or galactic map of pulsars. I mean, I just love the romance of that, going back to
Thank
the
you.
romance of all of this.
Amber, I know we're wrapping up. The picture does exist online. I don't know if you can find it. Carl Zimmer used to have a blog or a book about science tattoos. And if that's still online, it's there if you can find it.
Okay.
I know we're wrapping up, but I know you've been dropping links in the chat.
If anybody can
challenge
find
for
it,
you.
if anybody who can find it, it'll be Amber. You know, I already mentioned the golden record.
Yeah.
And that romance that is part of the story of the golden record between Carl Sagan and Anne Druyan.
Yeah.
Which is actually captured in a portion of the golden record, as you mentioned. I wonder if you thought about that part of humanity, which would be difficult to communicate, you know, because if you're going to start with the universal language of mathematics, how do you get from there to love, including the love that a parent has for a child, which, as you point out, is not something that is easy or maybe even possible to explain to another human being who has not had a child.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like my mom didn't totally appreciate that moment in the book, but I was writing it with love, where my mom would always say to me when I was a kid, when I was growing up, or even as an adult, she would say, you don't know what love is until you have a child. And I always thought she meant like, when you love a child, it's so much more that it puts all the other loves to shame, you know, just sort of in quantity. But in my experience, I'm so curious if he's awake still. I'll find out soon. In my experience, it's different. It's just different. The way that I think, you know, an alien's worldview or existence in the world might be. It's just a totally different thing.
I hope we get to find out before too long, while you and I and everybody else out there watching this are still around to enjoy that first contact, or just the discovery of something else out there that we can begin to learn from a second Genesis somewhere across the galaxy.
It would be cool.
Who knows, maybe even here at home. By the way, for anyone who hasn't noticed it, Amber did find Science Inc. tattoos of the Science Obsessed by Carl Zimmer. There it is in the chat, everyone.
Oh,
Jamie,
see, I don't know if I'm in the book, but anyway, and I clicked on that link and now I can't see anything. I've lost the other window.
Okay, well, the image she's showing us is of somebody's back, and I'm not sure I can make
that's
out
not
what
mine.
it is, but anyway.
But
this has been absolutely delightful, as I knew it would be, Jamie. And thank you so much again for this book and for joining us here. It really has been absolutely delightful. And what does it say here? Jim says, Jamie, I'd like to get you to sign my copy of your book one day soon. Okay,
oh my
Jim
gosh.
Green, I bet that could be.
Jim,
I bet that.
I don't know, Jim. I don't know if you're going to AbSciCon, the science conference, but I'll be there.
I wish I was going. I wish I was going.
Oh,
I know, Jim, I know. I think I'm going to see you next week. Here's a plug for Humans to Mars, the Humans to Mars Summit from our friends at Explore Mars. It is Tuesday and Wednesday next week. I think it's the 7th and 8th of May. There's still room available for this wonderful gathering of Martians. It's happening at George Washington University. I will be there once again, hosting the live stream and moderating some of the panels. And I know Jim Green's going to be there because I've seen him in the program as one of the presenters. And I'm really looking forward to it. You can check it out. Just Google Humans to Mars Summit, and you'll be able to see what's happening. It is one of my favorite events every year. Once again, Jamie, it has been wonderful talking with you. And I hope that we cross paths again.
I hope so too. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everyone I like opened up the chat just now at the end. It's so wonderful to see everyone talking about this, because when I was just starting out as a science writer, when I was still in graduate school, a piece that I wrote for Astrobites got sort of republished on the Planetary Society blog. And that was huge for me and meaningful as like a beginning science writer. So this is a kind of amazing full circle thing. So
You-
thank you. Yeah.
I had forgotten that. I looked that up and I saw that you
Yeah.
actually are, your content is present on our website. So
It's
look it
wild.
up, folks. Just put
Yeah.
in Jaime Green at planetary.org. And remember, everybody, if you missed any portion of this, it will be available at planetary.org/live and on our YouTube site, YouTube page, very soon, probably within a couple of days. And be sure to come back for our May book and a discussion with Bob Zubrin. There's the book, The New Worlds on Mars, What We Can Create on the Red Planet. It's going to be great fun. Jaime, once again, thank you, and have a wonderful night, and live long and prosper too. Yeah.
I can do it.
Goodbye. I can only do it with one hand for some reason. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. We are so glad that you are with us here in the community and that you make the society what it is. See you again soon, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.